The Center for Human Systems presents the Leadership and Self-Mastery program. This is the third module of the 3 Keys to Building Agreements for Success course. It's called Manage Your Ego. Don't let it manage you.
In this third module of the course Contracting, we're going to talk about ego management. My favorite topic always. Michael, what is the big idea of today's module?
Hello, Ronnie. Effective leaders have to keep their egos from interfering with the goals and needs of their relationships, teams, and organizations. Our egos can distract us from having the impacts that we want to make as leaders. Contracting for support around managing our egos is important since it's really hard to do it by ourselves.
Define ego for us.
Sure. Our ego is our sense of identity and self-esteem. It is our perception of who we are, interwoven with or confounded by our perceptions of what others think of us. The key words here are sense and perception. Our egos are not who we are, only our sense or perception of who we are. And there's the problem, depending on if our ego is needy or healthy. It is interesting that needy egos show up in 2 ways, big and small, but they result from the same problem of insecurity, although they manifest themselves in opposite ways.
All right, so let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about these needy and insecure egos. What are we going to start with?
Well, let's start off with needy egos, and then we'll talk about healthy egos.
Fair enough.
People with needy egos manage themselves through a sense of low self-esteem. As mentioned, there are 2 types of needy egos. Small egos, people who deal with their low self-esteem through self-denigration. It's like, the people who apologize for everything all the time. They kind of drive me a bit nuts. Then there are the people with the big egos, people who deal with their low self-esteem through an exaggerated sense of esteem. They often want to put down others. They often can be into bullying others. With needy egos, it doesn't take much stress for some threat to their sense of self-esteem or identity to be perceived and reacted to. That's when the ego gets in the way.
Okay, so I'm sorry, Michael, but I'm just going to interrupt you. That's not my ego talking.
Right?
That's
And
me.
I don't believe you're sorry at all. That's not part of it.
So I'm sorry. Let's continue. We've talked about needy egos, which manifest in 2 ways. Small egos, people who maybe are apologizing or are self-denigrating, and the people who are big egos, which often show up as bullying behaviors and all these other things, and they both stem from the same thing, sort of a deep sense of insecurity.
Yeah, let's also be clear that these are not sick people. I mean, these are just everyday, average, normal people who act just fine the great bulk of the time. But under stress, they may show up as either needy or arrogant. I don't know why that word is difficult for me to say. But yeah, people with healthy egos understand that they have egos. They also understand that they are not their egos. For a person with a healthy ego, more stress is needed before the ego feels the need to protect itself. I know of no one who has an ego that cannot be triggered to protect itself. It's just that if your ego is in pretty good shape, takes a pretty good deal of stress before you kind of really want to protect yourself and lose focus on what you are actually after. It is also useful to understand that having a healthy ego does not mean that one's sense of self is accurate. A great example is the typical teenager who thinks they know more than they really do. A teen with a needy ego would be devastated when they find out that they've been wrong. The teenager with a big ego would attempt to bluster their way through, having insisted that they really knew better all the time. The teen with the healthy ego is likely to simply be surprised by how ignorant they've been, but will accept the course correction and even be curious about it.
Well, it certainly sounds like you're talking about my family there. You know,
We're talking about everybody's family.
right. The big brother with the big ego, the other brother with the needy ego. They're both needy egos, but the smaller ego. Yes.
Yeah.
Good
But you
times.
had the healthy ego, right?
Absolutely. I am normal.
Got it.
So, uh, maybe you could give us an example in a work context how a needy ego kind of undermined leadership. Uh, and so we're talking about contracting. So just in this whole context of contracting, how does the ego undermine the leadership?
Super. I was working with the head of a branch of a famous museum. He had asked me to help him become a stronger leader. He was a very nice, easy, friendly guy. I did my usual set of diagnostic processes and facilitated a group session where his management team actually offered him their thoughts about how he could be a stronger leader. This was not a bashful group. The main thrust of the feedback was for him to be firmer in his decision making. It seemed that his decisions would shift depending upon the last person who talked to him. Even decisions that were made by the whole team would shift if someone who hadn't agreed fully chatted with him afterward. This was driving everybody nuts. In the feedback meeting, he vowed to stop being so flexible. That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, that would drive me nuts too.
Yeah. So a couple weeks went by. I went by and to just to do a routine check on how he and his team were doing it. Lo and behold, he hadn't changed a bit. When I asked him what happened, he just looked kind of sheepish and said, "Well, it's just I just want people to like me so much that it's really hard for me to say no to anyone." I said, "Well, clearly he's not going to be able to do this by himself." So I asked him, what support could he find that might help him to stick to his guns? He thought about it and said, well, let me ask my deputy to kind of sit in these meetings with me that can so that he can remind me to stay focused when I kind of get off base here. So I said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. Let's call your deputy in here so that three of us can really be sure that we're on the same page about what is needed here. Notice the good contracting that I'm forcing here.
Mhm.
So everybody's on board. The deputy and the leader were all in agreement. Scheduled a meeting for a week later. Came back, no change. No change. Other than a really frustrated deputy that said no matter what he did or said, he would waffle and go along with whatever somebody wanted him to do. So I was at the end of my rope in terms of being a consultant.
Okay.
So my next suggestion was that he needed to get professional help so that he could begin to get past this issue of his wanting to be liked so much. Until he did that, there was really nothing that I could do for him because I don't cross the boundary of moving from consultant to psychotherapist because that would have been too confusing for both of us.
Wow. Um, yeah, it sounded like he needed a lot of help in that instance.
Well,
So I just wanted to just recap what he did. That so he kept, in a sense, changing the contract. They would come to an agreement, and then he would, based on whoever he talked to in the last instance, change the agreement or whatever he had conveyed to his people. And that constant changing was undermining his leadership, undermining because he kept undermining the contract and undermining his leadership and undermining his relationships with his people because he kept waffling and changing and wasn't
absolutely.
leading.
Yes. What is fascinating about what you're saying is that in his mind, he was just forming a new contract with the last person that he was in the room with, which would screw up all of the other contracts. So it really became quite a mess. And that's kind of what it was. That's kind of what it was.
Yeah, so that's a really great example of someone who had this what you call a needy ego, a small needy ego that really undermined his effectiveness as a leader.
He
So,
needed to be liked so much that it got in the way of his being an effective leader and decision maker.
and what's interesting is that I think that all of us go through phases of that sometimes in our development as leaders or in our lives, working lives, where we want to be liked. So we'll find whatever agreements that we can have. I have done this in my personal life, where I've been trying to negotiate between, what one person wants over here and what one person wants over there, and I'm getting agreements from both of them, but not always communicating those agreements back and forth, which begs the decision why I'm in the middle at all. But that's a whole different thing.
Yes,
Um, so, Michael, is there another example you have for us of a different type of ego at work?
sure. Let's talk about a big ego here, and then we'll talk uh, about a healthy ego.
Okay.
So we're here with the head of a major medical center who brought me in because his number two person asked him to. I did my normal diagnostic process and interviewed his entire executive team and shared with him that they desperately wanted a clearer sense of direction from him. When I shared with him, he got very upset. Initially said it just wasn't true at all, that I was wrong, that I was just off base. Then he switched up and said, well, then maybe it wasn't me, but it was his executives just were not being as professional as they needed to be because he had been telling them over and over again what his vision was many times. And if they had just been listening, this would not be a problem. At no time did he accept any responsibility for the dysfunctionality of his team. He would blame it on me initially. He blamed it on them after he got past that. He left shortly after that to go to another medical center, which was kind of fortunate for me, of course. Uh, but in order for him to see himself as okay, he had to see his team as okay. Fascinating example. Therefore, if everything he sees is okay, he must be okay. Our minds and our egos can be very, very tricky, as we learned in the How Your Mind Works module of conscious use of self.
So, I mean, what's interesting about the story that you just shared is it reminds me in moments how I have been with my teams, where I say their lack of, an individual's lack of professionalism when I delegate a responsibility is is because they aren't able to speak up or listen to what I'm saying to them. Uh, so, is my ego being big in that instance?
Sounds like it. Sounds like it. You know, everybody has an ego, and everybody under some stress, that ego takes over and wants to protect itself. Now, basically, anytime we get into a blaming mode and we're saying it's somebody else's fault or we're blaming ourselves, that's often our ego speaking up. An effective leader avoids blaming and is focused on, okay, so what are we going to do next so that we can fix this or so that we can take our next step? Blaming, as we talked about in module 2, is an energy sponge. It doesn't do anything of use except it protects our dear little egos.
That's interesting. Yes, we did talk about that in that first course, conscious use of self, energy sponges. So let's go back to, well, what does contracting for ego management look like then?
Well, let's talk about managing a healthy ego first. That okay?
Okay. Yep.
Managing even a healthy ego is something that we could all use help with. My ego is fairly healthy, uh, but under a bit of stress. And keep in mind that this stress is often self-induced. So let's say I meet an attractive woman uh, outside of work, of course, and I would like to ask her out. Oh, I make that a stressful situation for myself. And my automatic triggers back to when I was a teenager and thought of myself as socially incompetent. So I wind up acting socially incompetent with this woman I want to impress. It's like, oh, what a mess! What a mess! So we all need help in some fashion. Now, so the key is once you can acknowledge that, once you can acknowledge that you have an ego that could use some support sometimes, contract with a trusted colleague or friend to kind of signal us when they notice that we're being ego ridden. And often that is all that is needed. I've worked with leaders who asked their entire team to simply say the word ego when they saw him being ego ridden. What was fascinating that each team member asked for the same thing then. As a result, the entire executive team contracted to support each other with ego management. It was fascinating to actually sit in a meeting with them and hear the word ego pop up every now and then, and there'd be kind of titters, and then the group would refocus and get back to work. Keep in mind that such contracting is not possible with someone who cannot acknowledge their ego issues.
There was a lot there. I'm going to refrain from commenting on your dating life for now. So that's amusing to me. Okay.
It's amusing to me too now. So it's okay.
Yeah, I think that I think it comes down to like, well, how do you then work with someone who can't acknowledge their ego issues? So unlike the group that you just shared that talked about, was a safe enough place where they could call out ego when they needed to. How do you, if you're working with someone who won't even talk about ego issues, what do you do?
Stay focused on what you need to get done. Now, to do that, the first thing you need to do is put aside your judgment of them. Because the tendency is, oh God, they've got such a big ego, or oh God, they've got such a needy ego. That is your ego sponge that is distracting you from what you need to do. If you can put your judgment aside, you can refocus. Forget trying to convince them that they have an ego. That'll simply make matters worse. So here are 4 things that you can try that mostly have to do with how you manage yourself, not the person with the ego. Number
Okay,
one,
I'm ready. I'm ready.
number one, let your judgments of the person go. Judging them will get in the way of your doing anything that might be useful. Remind yourself of a time when you were ego ridden. Number 2, listen appreciatively to whatever they have to share with you. Listening is a secret sauce in so many situations. Now, to do that, once again, you have to have done number 1, because I can't listen well if I'm judging the person that I'm trying to listen to. I'm paying attention to all my judgments instead. Number 3, offer the person a genuine positive acknowledgement. It could even be something as simple as, thank you for sharing that with me. Now, again, you won't be able to do this if you were still in judgment about the person. Number 4, refocus on what you want to accomplish with the person work-wise. Be patient in redoing all 4 steps as necessary. It's about you maintaining your focus rather than you distracting yourself with somebody else's ego, which is simply your ego at work.
So that's actually incredibly useful, Michael, because just I want to share something that happened just this week with me is that I felt my ego coming to the surface, um, where I was in the process of setting up a meeting, and this is all done via email. And someone jumped, the person that one of the people that I was collaborating with to set up this meeting with this third person, jumped in and set up the meeting without actually consulting with me on what times I was available for the meeting. I mean, and my first reaction was, I was the one setting up the meeting. So what the hell is he doing jumping in like this? Um, and then B, it's like, what is this arrogance that he didn't even bother asking? So I just had to like pause for a second, let that all go and say, what's important here is that we all have a conversation together about the work. And so I just said, I'm not available at that time. Can we find a different time? And that's what we did. And it was easy as that. But my first reaction was to just say, are you a moron? What are you doing? You didn't consult with me. And I had to resist that. Um, and so I just wanted to share with you that I do have an ego, and B, I am sometimes able to manage it.
Well done.
I'm wondering if you can just recap for us on how we manage our egos around contracting and how that's critical to becoming an effective leader.
Sure. It just makes sense that egos are a part of the psychological equipment we have. Now, I phrase that intentionally. It is equipment that we have. It is not who we are. Its purpose is to give us a sense of who we are and a way to protect that sense. It's also the locus of our sense of self-esteem, which it may also want to protect. Ironically, if our self-esteem is low, it wants to protect that as much as protect as what our self-esteem is high. So it's always used to puzzle me that if somebody has low self-esteem, trying to convince them that they should have high self-esteem doesn't work. They will defend that they have low self-esteem, that they've and that they've earned it.
Okay.
When we have a healthy ego, our need to protect our sense of identity or esteem is pretty low. When our egos are needy, that desire to protect can become pretty strong. In either case, when our egos are focused on protecting our sense of identity or esteem, it can distract us from our more conscious intentions, just as you talked about in your example. And when you noticed that that was your ego, you recognized it and you were able to manage it and refocus on what you actually needed to get done. And it worked just fine.
Yes.
Still, it's also useful to be clear that no matter how self aware we may be, under stress, our egos can automatically take charge of us. And keeping in mind that most of the stress is self induced. That's when we need reminders from some external source, somebody who could remind us that, Michael, you can manage this rather than being managed by it. To get those reminders, you need to contract for them with the folks who are most likely to be around when the stress is upon us. What's fascinating is that when you do that, people often will go, "Oh, sure, I'll do that for you. Will you do that for me too?" And it becomes incredibly valuable for both parties.
Great. Thank you for that.